This episode is sponsored by Linode. Linode is offering listeners of this podcast a $20 credit, which is good for 4 free months at their lowest plan. Their plans start at 1 gigabyte of RAM for $5 a month. You can get your servers in any of their 10 data centers, and their high memory plans start at 16 gigabytes. Get a server running in under a minute. They do hourly billing with a monthly cap on all plans, and add-on services like backups, node balancers, Longview, etc. VMs for full control, running Docker containers, encrypted disks, VPNs, etc. You can run a private Git server. They provide native SSD storage, 200 gigabit network, and Intel E5 processors. They have 24/7 friendly support, even on holidays, and a 7-day money-back guaranteed. So go check them out at linode.com/adventures in Angular. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another Adventures in Angular. This week on our panel, we have Ward Bell.
Hello.
Shai Reznik.
Hello there. I won't say what I'm wearing, but it's very hot in here. Yeah. Hey.
John Papa.
Hot in here.
Good morning, Vietnam.
Joe Eames.
Hey, everybody.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. Quick shout out about JS Dev Summit, JavaScript Dev Summit. It's coming up in May, so keep an eye out for speaker announcements and things like that. We also have a special guest, and that's, let me see if I can do this without slaughtering his name, Doguhan Uluca.
Hi, here's Doguhan Uluca, so it's pretty close.
Awesome. Well, do you want to give us just a brief introduction, who you are, who you work for?
Absolutely. I work for a consulting company in Washington, D.C. Called Excella, and I'm the JavaScript Specialty lead and a software development expert for the company. So this means I engage with a lot of different kinds of clients from the federal, nonprofit, and commercial space.
Awesome.
I do things.
You have a meetup, no?
Correct, yes. I am the founder of the Tech Talk DC meetup. We host a monthly event for polyglot developers. And we tend to cover the whole gamut of the popular languages out there, from the front end to the back end. And also last year, I organized a DC Full Stack Web Summit. It was a small conference with about 100 people in attendance.
So
Nice.
what do you think? Do you think JavaScript's going to become popular?
I think in a few more years. I mean, it hasn't yet gotten into every computing platform in the world. Some mainframes still can't run JavaScript.
Right.
Do you know that I used to be a polyglot and I'm cured now?
Are you a uniglot, Shai? Uniglot?
Yeah, now I'm a uniglot.
He's a semiglot.
Semiglot.
So that's actually a pretty good point there. Being a polyglot is great to borrow ideas from other languages, but in practice, actually being active in multiple languages, that's a lie, in my opinion.
That's a lie.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that opinion, and I want to hear more about it. So let's say, all right, let me give you an argument, right? Like say I'm doing .NET development on the back end, I'm JavaScript on the front end, and I say I'm a polyglot developer. Is that not it, or like?
Well, JavaScript doesn't count really. Like if you're doing just for front end development, it doesn't count, in my opinion, because you have to know it to be able to do or get your stuff done.
Okay. So what is a polyglot then? What's a true polyglot?
Tough question for a guy who runs a meetup for polyglots. I think it's knowing different kinds of programming techniques and languages out there, being aware of these technologies, and being able to understand the common thread that runs amongst them, and being able to differentiate between them, if that makes any sense.
Oh, so it's not a disease. Okay.
Well, the topic that we have on the docket is to do more with less and router first architecture. And I'm kind of curious. So do more with less? Does that mean I get to delete code?
Yeah, so those are actually my most productive days at work. Is if my code contribution to the code base is in negative lines of code, I consider that a success.
Do you want to explain why? Because it sounds counterintuitive, and I know that some of the listeners, especially newer folks, they're like, wait a minute, aren't I being paid to write code, not delete code?
Well, so I think the sense that we're being paid to write code, I think that's the wrong mindset. We are there to solve a problem using code. So being able to correctly understand what's being asked of us and translating that into code, can happen either efficiently or extremely inefficiently. And one of the troubles that I see out there is, people are so eager to code. They jump in at the first sound of someone saying I want this, and they don't stop to ask questions about wait, okay, so how is this actually going to work? So they end up coding a lot, and then the code is going to naturally evolve over time anyway. So they end up chasing their own tails in a sense, just trying to catch up to some ever changing vision by just throwing more code at the problem. From a JavaScript perspective, in the past, let's just call it this decade, really, there's been a gluttony of JavaScript frameworks that people just thought, oh, this is a cool framework, let me just pull it in. So before you know it, you're dealing with 20 different plugins or frameworks that you're working with, and lo and behold, each and every single one of these things have their own little bugs and quirks. So that's where the philosophy of do more with less comes from. Is if you always try to achieve that 100% functionality, if you try to appease every single stakeholder that's out there, you're going to find yourself in that spot where you have a ton of code, 20 plates spinning at once, so to speak. So by reducing your toolkit, by going back to the basics, the fundamentals, and actually learning what a framework can truly do for you, you can reduce a lot of dependencies. So of course, this won't take you to 100%, appeasement. You'll be able to get 80% of the stuff done with 20%, just applying that 80-20 rule in general. And then from there, it really comes down to, okay, where are we at? Do we have something releasable? Do we have a big enough team to be able to handle a lot of edge cases? But being conscious of that fact.
So let me just try to summarize or to understand what you're saying. So you're saying that there's like a gazillion libraries out there, and people just like npm install and forget about it, and just like use a bunch, and sometimes in large projects even duplicated functionality from different sources, and that creates a problem, because then like you have bugs and you have more maintainability issues and stuff like that. So what you're saying is try to figure out if you already have something, maybe it's a native thing, maybe it's something you're already using, like, I don't know, Lodash or something like that can solve the problem, instead of try to import yet another library, or try to, I don't know, reinvent the wheel, so to say. So that's what you're saying?
Absolutely, okay. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
How does it relate to router first, like, I don't know, development? Or
so I mean, they are separate ideas, but it does that general philosophy does relate, because this. So I'm writing this book, hands-on Angular for full stack developers. Got the first draft completed. And thank you. While I was working on that, I came up with this approach of, I wanted to formalize it really, and call it and give it a name. where you come up with the walking skeleton of your application first, your design first, defining your user roles, that then dictates, what you're going to need down the road to be able to build your app. So it's teasing out, requirements as early as possible, so that you have a roadmap before you start actually refining things, before you actually start writing code.
Okay, so I'm kind of lost there because I don't understand how it relates to the gazillion libraries problem, and how does it relate to the problem? Because usually, from my experience, I usually look at the user interface and extract from there, right, from the usability point of view, and then like only test-driven develop the features that I really need to follow the Yagni rule, right? You ain't going to need it. And not just write like everything just in case I will need it someday. So,
right. So, and that's a very good point. So the idea there is to do a rough design first of everything. Ask all the hard questions in the beginning of your project, which will allow you to identify various user components and shared code ahead of time. So when you're picking a user component library, such as Angular Material or ng Prime, or you're going to roll your own, or you're going to pull in 50 different things, then you're going to be able to have a high-level conversation of, look, we're going to need a data table, we're going to need a form stepper, or we're going to need gauges, basically a laundry list of various user controls that you may need in your application. And you will also be able to identify various components that you do need to spend some more time engineering, so that it is indeed reusable. So, for example, it could be a user profile component where you view a user's, details. So that's useful if I'm viewing my own profile data. That's useful in a master detail view. As an admin, if I click on a user, then I see their detail information. And if I can reuse the same component, great. And if I can identify this ahead of time, then I'm going to save some time of architecting my application, so that I don't have to evolve it so aggressively over time.
So what I'm hearing is that essentially what you're saying is, instead of, because it sounded initially, at least for me, that you were advocating the oft-demonized waterfall method of doing development. And what it sounds like is, instead what you're saying is like, look, kind of get a picture of the shape of the application without necessarily defining every little detail of the application, and then start thinking about what are the commonalities across the entire app, so that I can make those decisions ahead of time. And that way, when I move forward, I don't have to figure out, okay, I'm in the thick of building this component in here. How do I do it? It's, oh, well, I'm using this across the app, and I already know that I can put this component in multiple places. And so I'm just going to put it in here and then customize it as needed.
Exactly. And I'm a proponent of Agile. I'm a certified Scrum professional. So in a sense, I've been through the looking glass in terms of Agile development. I've seen the kind of the ugly side of it, and the good parts of it. And I keep going back to a particular example that was given during my training, as before before you start painting your Mona Lisa, you want to first draft it with pencil, right? And then you kind of iterate over it, block by block, painting, the different layers of it or different components of it. But you can't start, with just painting and finishing off a corner of Mona Lisa and then have an idea of how this is going to look like. So you gotta do that drafting work first.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So when you talk about that, you're talking about actually writing a prototype code, or just like designing it without any code?
So and that is the wonderful thing about that I have discovered about Angular 5 is you can actually, write the code. You can write the router code. You can generate the components, and you can wire everything up together and have a walking skeleton and navigation experience of your app that will go to production someday. It's just you haven't filled in any of the details yet.
Okay, so, and this is what you call router first?
Correct. Yeah. So literally, the first thing you implement is all the router configuration stuff ahead of time. So you use that to drive your then architectural decisions from that point on.
Okay, cool.
So
And
if like one route at a time, I do a route and then I implement it, or we like?
Oh no, I'm talking about just create all the components that you imagine can be there, as much as you can ahead of time. So create all the routes.
I've never done that. I've never. I admit that I get to the router sooner than I expected, but my first try, of course, I only write demos. Is I try to live without the router. Yeah, I don't actually get very far with a real application. So I do see it providing a certain kind of a backbone, but I don't think I have ever tried to populate it with stub components, which is an interesting idea. So maybe you can tell us. I mean, I don't know if the other folks here are like I am, but even if I do what you're saying there, and I put a router in really early just so I can lay down the app routing module, get the behaviors going, and start thinking about the scheme. But I'm probably more likely to just bring up my first page and just work on that for a while and see how that feels. But you're saying no, you would stub out your vision of the whole app?
So if you are working with more than, I'm going to go ahead and say more than 2 developers on a team, there's a lot of benefit to triggering that planning phase, that visioning, coming out with a sitemap and determining what kind of user roles there might be in the app, if there are multiple user roles. And then, yes, indeed, go ahead and stub everything out. And there are some side effects from this. Initially you eat up a couple of weeks doing more kind of preparatory planning type work. But after that, you end up with a vessel, or so to speak, where then multiple people can just start filling in the blanks, because how they're going to interact is already determined, which is usually the hard part. And then you just iterate over the various components to completion. And this also forces people to write decoupled components, because they just write every component with the idea of every component is going to grab its own data. So they're going to be self-sufficient. So as requirements evolve over time, that's also another nice thing about the router is you can, using auxiliary paths, you can really remix your UI as you go through your development adventure.
Okay, so how long? So you're saying that in the start you have like the MVP or a POC of the product that you want to build. So you go ahead and build all the components you can think of, and then it's at a certain. So you get to version 1 and you release it, and then you do some more research and you need to change stuff and you need to optimize stuff, and so then you fall back probably into the same old grow it as the requirements comes in or something like that model, right? Which is not like, again, try to spawn off as many components as you can or something like that. Or are you saying that it should be like the the methodology, so to say.
Right. So, there's usually a product manager or a product owner involved, and they have a good sense of, the scope of your first release. And, usually these efforts take, I'm just going to put a number out there, 6 to 12 months for, sizable projects. So, taking that time in the beginning to trigger some of those conversations about, okay, what is the vision? Because they have I'm sure you all have seen the comics strip with, regarding requirements, how, the product manager or the customer has this idea of a tire swinging, off a tree branch. And then as it goes through various phases of development, that takes, bizarre shapes. And even a product manager may not be able to correctly express, what they have in mind, or they may not really know what they really want, and they're just waiting to see something and react to it. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to go to the first wrong answer as quickly as possible. And I found if you start with the first task and really just focus on it, that can put you in a position where a few months down the road, you kind of you're in a deep execution mode, and then you pull your head up and you look around and you realize, oh no, we don't have enough time to do everything now, or oh no, we went down the wrong path here. Now we're going to have to backtrack. So I am suggesting this approach so that you ask the hard questions ahead of time, and it is not comfortable to have some of these questions so early in a project, but it's definitely mutually beneficial to both the developer and the business side of the development process.
Do you have an example of where this has paid off for you?
Yeah. About a few months ago, I was engaged in developing a prototype for a company, and they had this beautifully designed prototype created in a tool, but they weren't really sure how it was going to interact in the context of a real framework. So I picked Angular 4 and Angular Material as my toolkit going into it, and I kind of focused on making every component I create reusable through the router, just passing in all the information through route parameters, and each component being responsible of fetching its own data, etc. Through services, of course. And as I was going through this effort, and it was a 4-week time box effort, the requirements indeed start changing on me. They wanted certain components. There were these master detail views, and then you could click on a search button and search for a person, and then view their detail. And then when you go back, you still had to be able to click on so the master component, and then the detail you got changed from team details to person details. So a lot of moving parts, and by using or focusing on the router, I was able to really create a lot of alternative routes, and just using auxiliary paths and through router links, I was able to really easily change how the various screens appeared to the user by being able to display different components in the master or the detail part of the screen quite easily.
Cool.
Does this mean that you are creating a lot of nested child routes and stuff? So kind of walk through a process of what you might do.
Yeah. So in that case, I also wanted to demonstrate lazy loaded routes to them. So I created a feature module, even though it was the only feature module, and then within the feature module, that owned its own routing mechanism, and then every feature module kind of has to have its own home screen, kind of mimicking how an Angular app is set up at the root level, and then the the home route usually has its own toolbar with its own router outlet, which means then there needs to be a nesting happening there, and then under that, a particular screen that you go to may have or will have various child routes. So it is nested, but I would say not more than 2 or 3 levels down, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Do you make every component routable, or do you stop at a certain point? Are you using auxiliary routes, that kind of thing?
So that is also a very good point. So my preference is to make every component routable, but there is a caveat in there where it makes sense. So I have this sample project on GitHub that is in support of my book. It's called Lemon Mart. And there, for example, I have a particular component where you can view your user profile details. And in one context, it's displayed in a master detail view context. And in that case, it's routable. And in another context where you're first creating your profile or you're updating your profile details, it's part of a form with multiple steps. And then I reuse that component at the last step to show you a kind of a summary of all the information that you entered. In that particular instance, I actually bind the data that's in the form into the component. It's the same component, and it can either be bound to or routed to. And I find that an interesting way to reuse code.
Let me give you a challenging one that may help me understand. Suppose it's a dashboard, right? And it could have an arbitrary number of, well, let's say 2 to 10 components appearing in it. Would one have a single route that would populate each of the, decide which of those components were to appear on that dashboard in what order and where they were, all that governed by a route? Or would you say, no, maybe not?
As any good engineer would respond to that, it depends.
It depends.
If it's a one-off dashboard, and it's going to remain fairly static, those 8 to 10 components, then I would just say go ahead and just take the easiest path to, or the path of least resistance to accomplishing that task. But which would be just creating the components and binding their data to them, all that stuff. However, if there's a chance of this dashboard becoming first, you may implement multiple dashboards for multiple levels of people. It might be a customizable dashboard. Then implementing various router outlets to it for every 8 to 10 component, you're basically defining okay, I'm going to have something render here, so you're pre-dividing the page into 8 or 10 parts, and then you're letting the router take care of okay, now I'm going to render these 8 particular components in there, and you might have a total of 16 components to choose from, for example. And in my view, that makes things more maintainable. because that forces you to think about each component as an independent component that is not related to any other component. Because when you go down the road of binding data, you may be unintentionally introducing various dependencies between components. Like you may be receiving an event from a component and then using that to trigger something else in another component, and these kinds of coupling over time makes your job more and more difficult in terms of maintaining that whole set of stuff.
So I put that challenge to you in part because I get the idea of designing components so that they are decoupled. And routing would certainly force you to do that, but that is one heck of a hammer to try and solve that problem with, because I personally find the routing structures can get really opaque and very hard to understand pretty quickly. And so I love the idea of trying to, doing what I can architecturally to keep those components decoupled, but the router could get, using the router as my only driver for that makes me, maybe I'm just not good enough at the router. I don't know. But you can get some nasty configuration and spend a lot of time trying to get that thing working to achieve this result. And I'm inclined to think that there are other approaches. And I just pushed that back in case people were thinking you really mandated that all components be the destination of a route, and and that's not what you're saying, and I get that, and so our listeners will understand they have some flexibility.
Are you ready to master Angular? Oasis Digital offers Angular Bootcamp, a 3-day intense workshop class for individuals or teams. They cover Angular 4 and 2 and focus on the skills and knowledge you need for complex, data-rich applications. They also still offer AngularJS for teams supporting older projects. Bring them to your site or send developers to them in St. Louis, San Francisco, New York, D.C., and other cities, and online at angularbootcamp.com.
Absolutely. And it also has to be said that I've been going to NGConf for 3 and it'll be 4 years in a row now. And we've been waiting for the promise of the awesome router for almost that long. And I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised this fall when I pushed the router to its limits. It was able to kind of live up to my expectations of it. Now, are there some issues with it? Yes, there are, but I think there are some documentation challenges surrounding some of the finer features of the router. But and this is an educated guess from me, is that over time it will only get better.
Let me give you a different take. So I think I'm trying to follow it. I've been mostly listening to kind of understand kind of where you're directing people. What I'm actually hearing, and we all hear things differently, is you really focus on trying to get that UI and that experience, at least the layout of it, set in place first. The router is just the vehicle that you're using to get there, but you're trying to get that vehicle to help you put the UI in place with no data, with no HTTP, with no, business rules and the security, etc. Just let's make sure the flow of this thing is looking like the way you want it, so we don't have a swing flying through a tree trunk, right?
Correct, yeah.
And I think what I'm hearing pushback with Ward on, and I kind of agree there too, is that if someone were to take, and I know you're not saying this, but if someone were to take you too literally and say, hey, create a router for every single component, that would be kind of crazy, because in the end, the app, if you had like 100 views, and some of the apps that have over 1,000 components, if you did that, that would end up with like some nest of a router structure. It might be like 20 levels deep, and the code to actually put the router together is what kind of gives me a little pause. Setting up first level routing, I often personally start the project by setting up a little bit of what you do, which is setting up that first level routing to get my main navigation in place. So I can start plugging things in where I need to. And maybe I don't put every single route menu item in, but I try to get the core stuff there at least an example of every kind of unique situation, right? Like if these two are heroes and villains, I probably wouldn't do both. I'd probably just do one of them just to show there's an example. But if I had a different kind of scenario, I'd add those in. But generally, I'll stop at that level of routing in the beginning of a project, only because my personal experience has been once users in the business stakeholders get a hold of that UI, even the things that they thought they wanted start to change quite a bit. And I would hate to have too much routing in place, like lower than that level, simply because the code to change routing is pretty involved. Is that, you're nodding your head, people can't see you, I know we're on a podcast, but I'd love to hear your response to that.
Yeah, and so I do agree with that. And if we're talking about a large enough project, perhaps iterating over that initial design process and putting. So the goal here is always to put something tangible in front of the customer, the client, or the business person as soon as possible. And if it's and this doesn't always have to be a week or 2 weeks, a set period of time. If it's just an afternoon and you're done, with your an initial idea of how things are going to look like, just send it to the customer for feedback and try and get that initial feedback as early as possible. I guess with every suggestion, if you take it to the extreme, it's likely not going to work out well. But
that's a great phrase. I agree.
And in my concrete examples, I set everything as especially if it's an authenticated app, I set almost everything as a lazy loaded feature module, so that initial user experience, that first paint of the application, is as quick as possible. And then when you log in, you grab all the components necessary to display, user profile related stuff or navigational related stuff.
Right, getting that time to first byte, that percent down as small as you can for whatever that first thing they're supposed to see is in the app, right?
Yeah, and I've
to that restaurant, John. Time to first bite.
We have a great idea now. Let's go start one up.
Yeah, I will say though that having been a consultant, you are correct in that a lot of times they won't know what they want until they see it. And so, yeah, I mean, if you can pull a lot of this together and just kind of give them an idea, this is what you're looking at getting before you do a lot of building, you're probably going to get a lot of things clarified before you put hours and hours and hours into putting together whatever it is that they thought they wanted.
Yeah. So, and it's also this idea of, for example, in, Scrum, they recommend, certain number of hours to do your planning or, et cetera. But, the amount of time you're going to spend planning is going to be proportional to the amount of time you have available, right? If you're a 20-person team with 2-week sprints, you're likely going to go through hours and hours of planning. So, same with what I'm suggesting here, so if it's a small enough project, don't spend more than a few hours, setting up your initial, routes and your initial walking skeleton of your application, but if you're going into something that's a year long with, 20 developers and, as many stakeholders involved, then, jumping into the first story and everyone just swarming around and trying to perfect this first screen kind of sets everyone on a path where 6 months down the road they'll emerge and they're like, okay, we've been spending way too much time on these screens that don't really matter. We haven't gotten to the good stuff yet because nobody teased that out early enough. So I think it's fair. It's fair to take some time in the beginning, and iterate over that vision in a more concrete manner.
I often spend, I like where you're going with this. I often spend what I call sprint zero when I work in iterative places as well, whether it's a 2 week, 3 week sprint, whatever. Sprint zero for me, a lot of that is kind of making sure before you start that race to the end of the project, whether it's a 2-person project or a 200-person project. We've all been on both of those kinds, I think, in this room, but spend that sprint figuring out, is the plumbing right? Is the architecture right? Ward and I tend to use the word the shell of the app a lot. Is the shell of that app really conducive to the rest of it? Because if you don't get the shell right, it's really hard to get the pieces to fit properly in there. And even like the responsive nature of CSS. So I like where you're going with that, and definitely agree getting stuff into the user's hands. I wanted to ask you a question of something that you hinted at, though. Slight tangent. You mentioned using lazy loading everywhere so they can get the experience fast up front. I'm curious, how do you take advantage of the preloading fetching strategies? Like, how do you make the decisions on those?
So I guess let me ask for a clarification on preloading and fetching.
Okay. So when you said lazy loading, Angular has these, I forget the exact syntax. It's like on preload, was it preload always strategy or preload never strategy is the two default ones, where you can tell lazy loading stuff, the bundles to come across and load in the background, or to never do it until it's on demand. Or you can set up a custom one based upon business rules. This is a discussion I had at NG Vikings last week with a couple of attendees. I'm just kind of curious, since you use lazy loading for all your stuff, how you approach that strategy.
So in terms of operation, let me redo that. In terms of operations, I haven't really gotten to that point of deploying a large scale enough application for that decision to matter. So I'm gonna I guess share my opinion in terms of how I think it should work. And because in most applications that I tend to work, there is the first thing you see is a login box. And beyond that, you just don't, if you're not authenticated, then you're not going to get anything else. So in that sense, not lazy loading at all makes a lot of sense, because that way we save a lot of our infrastructure, not delivering that piece of code that's never going to be actually used on the client side.
Can I push back on that?
Absolutely, yes.
I mean, the thought here is that actually you can get to that initial screen that you can fight through, but you have a pretty good idea. You take an optimistic view. Most people who get there are going to sign in effectively. And most of them are going to probably need, you can make a pretty good prediction that most of the time they're going to need some module that you don't need during login, but you were almost certain to need no matter where they go after that. And so it makes some sense to begin that process while the user is distracted signing in and lazy load this thing in background. It's kind of halfway between eager and lazy, and then it gets there. So that's the way in which it can be an effective use of the user's time. Just make the app more responsive, because like 99% certain that if they don't sign in, it's not going to matter anyway, and they never saw it. But if they do get in, they're going to need that module. And I think that's kind of what John is going at. But returning to your original point, which is that even such a module that is as sort of loaded as soon as possible, but not at the start, it still has the structure of a lazy module. It has the isolation of a lazy module. It has that decoupling that I think was one of the drivers behind your decision to try and make features lazy loaded. Does that feel right to you?
Yeah. And that discussion of preloading or fetching on demand. There are a lot of variables embedded in that. So one of the guidance that I give to people all the time is don't focus on the performance. of what you're doing. When you're unless you're running on your production hardware, don't try to pre-optimize what you're doing. Because preloading might be fine, and it might bring tangible benefits to the user, or on-demand, or you may not be able to tell the difference depending on your infrastructure or your situation. So I do try to come out with generalized recommendation of the 80-20 use case. 80% of the time, if you're writing a web application that has a potential of a user with a mobile phone kind of accessing that site, they want to get the least amount of possible, and they're not going to want their phones downloading something in the background. So this is not necessarily
that's a business decision.
Exactly. Yeah.
I certainly see the architectural point, though, because the minute you wrap a feature and you make it lazy loaded from the start, you guarantee a certain kind of decoupling from all of the other features that forces you to think about boundaries, and that could become important later. And so it's probably a pretty good discipline. I'm lazy, and I don't mean that in a lazy load sense.
And well, actually, my boss has a pretty good saying. I'm not lazy. I'm just highly efficient.
No, I'm lazy. I'm not efficient at all.
I'm eager and lazy.
So by making disciplined architectural decisions, we defer decision making to the last moment possible. So whether the fact that whether we preload or fetch on demand, that's something that becomes a point of configuration that can be changed or even A/B tested over time to determine the effectiveness of the strategy. And if the business need is there, really, we should be talking about Angular Universal to even deliver a more aggressive, first paint.
Done. But we started the conversation with like the overflow of libraries and how you can minimize that and all that stuff. And like a couple of months into development, how does that relate to the first approach, if it relates? And if not, how do you still solve that problem when you have moving parts and like 5 developers on the team and everyone is like on their own pace and doing their own thing? And, you'll get into some collisions or some extra unnecessary code. How do you deal with that?
So there is some relation there, because by going this route of hold the pun intended, going router first with lazy loading, we are able to parallelize the efforts. But ultimately, all the dependencies are living in the same package.json file. So in a sense, it becomes an easier task to be the dependency cop. So it's not going to magically remain a disciplined project by just setting it up and letting it go. Over time, there will be entropy. People will introduce libraries left and right, and it's up to it's up to your peers, or your architect or your development lead to then ask the tough questions of, do we really need this library, or why do we need it? Or if it's really needed, is it only needed in this particular module? So we only send that down to the client if the user loads that particular feature.
By the way, on the same topic of lazy loading, just a side question, really, really tiny question, like how do you deal with entry components with lazy modules if you encounter that problem?
Could you clarify what you mean by entry modules?
Entry components.
or entry components.
So you have like modules and pop-up screens and all that stuff that sits with like a lazy loaded module or something like that. And there is a problem, there is a limitation, the same limitation with services, because lazy loaded modules creates...
Yeah, I think you probably, for a lot of listeners, they may not even have ever encountered the entry components section of a module. It might be good to, even explain that it's actually a section and in your module there's an entry component section, and normally Angular set up for you. I don't know, maybe you got a better explanation.
I don't know if it's related to this, and we probably maybe should discuss it on a different episode. That just like if you had like a short answer, that's fine. If not, that's okay. We can discuss it on a different episode.
One thing I will say is, from a UX perspective, I hate pop-ups and dialogues.
But
as much as
how do you advertise your pills otherwise?
so
effective.
In terms of certain shared user components, like your toast notifications, or like confirmation dialogues, or okay, cancel, yes, no, type of dialog boxes. I actually, in combination with Angular Material, I actually like creating a UI service that just sits at the very core of the application, so that it becomes very easy to pop a notification or ask for a confirmation in the control flow of your of the logic that you're implementing, without having to write and rewrite that boilerplate code all over the place. I know it's not answering your question at all, but
no, that's okay.
That is my approach.
I realized it's another scope, and that's okay. But thanks for sharing.
No problem.
I think it's a good point to wrap up on. That we can. I like to wrap up with if you were going to tell somebody like how they should get started with this and how they should get guided into learning more about it. Obviously, your book is a great resource for that. But where's that? What's the first thing you'd ask them to look at?
You can get into router first approach by examining my example project, Lemon Mart, on my GitHub account. It's github.com/DULUCA. And by examining that project, you will be able to see the various strategies of structuring your application. And the README of the project is robust enough that it also details various steps of this approach. There are 7 steps that I describe: defining user roles and a sitemap early on, designing with lazy loading in mind, implementing a walking skeleton navigation experience, designing around major data components, and being disciplined to sticking to a decoupled component architecture, and leveraging TypeScript classes, interfaces, enums, validators, and pipes as much as possible to maximize code reuse. In fact, that's a commonly missed part of Angular, in my opinion, where we're not just working with Angular here; we're also working with TypeScript. And there's where appropriate, bringing in those object-oriented programming concepts can really help encapsulate business logic and bring in a flavor of that domain-driven design into our front-end development, and actually make things easier for us.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and do some picks. Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love. And you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. John, do you want to start us off with picks?
So I only have one pick today, and that is Twitch. I've been learning how to use Twitch as a development platform to share ideas with people lately. And actually tomorrow, which will be in the past by the time this episode airs, Ward Bell and I are going to be pair programming on Twitch. We do this every Thursday now at 2 p.m. Eastern. It's really cool. So you go to twitch.tv and you can subscribe to my channel if you want. You watch me. Basically, it's an awesome way where you can live code with people and they can interact with you and chat with you and kind of help you build things along the way. And then we open source this stuff at the end of the episode. I think it's a fantastic way to engage with people that you just can't do through like webinars and Pluralsight videos and Egghead. Where all that's like one directional. So really excited about how Twitch is heading.
Nice. Yeah. And do you use the VS Code Live Share feature, the new one? Did you try it?
Once I have tried it. Yes. Once it's fully released, I think we'll do more of that. But right now there's a limited, I don't know if it's called a beta alpha or whatever. It's a limited release right now. But right now we're just having Ward basically
yell at
Zoom
John.
in or Skype in. He yells at me.
Yeah,
He tells me what to type.
John, up, left, no, down, right. Oh, there. Put it there. That's good.
I was looking for the nice way to say that word.
Yeah.
But yes, we'll use live share once it's there.
Sounds like my wife, but edit that out, Chuck. Yeah. Cool. Which is cool. I'm going to try it as well.
Yeah, those limited releases. If only you knew somebody who worked at Microsoft, John. All right. Joe, what are your picks?
All right. So I have played a bunch of board games this last weekend because I went to a board game convention and had a super, super, super awesome time. So I probably got about 45 possible board game picks I could make, but I'm just going to pick one. One of the new ones that I played that I thought was really fun, which is Wasteland Express Delivery Service, which sounds super awesome, doesn't it?
Sounds amazing.
It's a board game about, you're basically the mail in a post-apocalyptic world, and you have to go around and fight monsters and mutants and deliver the mail come rain or shine.
Isn't that a Kevin
much like,
Costner movie?
I think it is. It's pretty much like really just being a mail deliverer, that's how it was. For my mom, when she was a mail carrier, she fought all kinds of mutants and stuff. No, it's a great game, really fun, and that's to be my pick is Wasteland Express Delivery Service.
Awesome.
I have a few picks.
Go for it.
Go. Okay, so first of all, one pick is rxviz.com, VIZ, which is an animated playground for RxJS observables, which is kind of cool. Cool tool to play around with that. I think either Pete Bacon Darwin or Mike Brocky recommended to me while we were working on our talk for NGConf, which is going to be about switch map, and it's going to be really bizarre, but educational. So that's one thing. And the other one, if I mention NGConf, they're doing a cool thing this year where they are taking some of the speakers to dinner, but with attendees. So like private dinners up to 5-6 people, for people who wanted to go out with a certain speaker, sort of like dating, but I don't know, group dating. And it's kind of cool because I think more conferences should do stuff like that, because I know that most of my friends who are speakers love the most like the interaction with the attendees, and like meeting new friends and talking about like stuff. And this is the best thing about conferences. And you can probably watch the lectures afterwards on YouTube. So doing more cool things like this. So they actually have a link for each like speaker, and if you buy a ticket using that link, you will get signed up to that dinner. So I have a link. I think, John, you have a link. Or I think you have a link as well. So we might publish our links, okay? And you can choose who you want to go to dinner with. So those are my picks. So props to NGCon for doing that. I think it's a really cool idea.
I love it.
You hear that, Joe?
I do. Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Sure.
All right. Ward, what are your picks?
Okay, so I'm picking a book that I picked up on my flight home from Finland, NG Vikings, which was fantastic. And it's called Homo Deus by this guy Harari. People have been talking about him a while, and he's a historian, philosopher type who looks at trends in the species behavior and the world events, and tries to project out what tendentially where the species is headed, and what kinds of things we as a species will be working on over the next 2 centuries. And this is not the kind of book I would normally spend time with. I'm not that much of a futurist. But it was recommended by Daniel Kahneman, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. And I thought, well, I got to take a look at that. And it is pretty darn engaging. And it has some surprises in it about where our concerns will be or likely to be, including the quest for immortality and pleasure and things like that. So you might find that kind of thing interesting.
We're finally going to learn to use the Force. All right. I've got a couple of picks. So I did announce at the beginning of the show JavaScript remote, or I keep saying remote conference, but I've changed the terminology. JavaScript Dev Summit, free to attend live. If you buy a ticket, that goes to support the shows. And it also, a chunk of that goes to the speakers as well. And I'm working on adding in some freebies. By then, I'll probably have my course on automating code processes done. So things like CI. I'm going well beyond that though, so it'll probably include a discount code of some kind in there and things like that. So definitely get that checked out. Also, I am re-recording the videos for my Getting a Job course. So if you're looking for a way to get a job, you can go to getacoderjob.com, and you'll get my Finding Your Dream Programming Job course. You can go and buy that there. And I walk you through everything, setting up your resume, meeting people who work for the companies you want to work for, figuring out if the company's a good fit for you, how to do interviews, how to negotiate salaries. I mean, the whole 9 yards. So if you're interested in that, go check that out as well. And I think that's about all I got. Doguhan, what do you want to pick?
All right, I have a couple of picks. The first one is the JavaScriptPromise.com. That's my website where I've kind of hand out as a jumping point for all of my various content. So I'll soon be updating that with everything we talked about on the show here. And I'll also be given a series of talks at some Agile conferences this year titled Ship It or It Never Happened. So there will be some good information on containerizing your application and being able to deploy that to Heroku, ZiteNow, AWS, or various other targets. And then the second one is a personal favorite, runkit.com. That is a node execution environment where you can require NPM packages on the fly and kind of do coding katas and hone a particular function or a particular piece of code that you want to put into your application, but just test it out, find out what works, what doesn't work, and because it's online, you can easily share what you've been working on with friends, and you can even turn it into an API if you want to. So it's a really cool tool that saved me a lot of time, and it also enabled me to finally get rid of Lodash as a dependency. I can survive on just ES6 functions and RxJS.
Cool. And you said the JavaScript Promise is your blog, or a jumping off point for everything else anyway?
It's a jumping off point for everything else.
All right. If people do want to connect with you, then is that the best place to go? Are you on Twitter or anywhere else that you want to shout out about?
You can follow me on Twitter at Duluca, Duluca. But my website has links to my GitHub, NPM, Docker Hub, and my LinkedIn as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming and getting our minds going about a lot of this stuff.
Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, we'll wrap this one up and we will catch everybody next week.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.